Hi, my name is Ann Neumann, and I'm editor of The Revealer, which is a publication of the Center for Religion and Media at New York University. I teach journalism at Drew University in New Jersey, and I am a journalist. I've written for, among other publications, The Nation, Guernica Magazine, and New York Law Review. I've been asked to talk to you about the profession of journalism and about what exactly journalists do. But first I want to lay out the landscape of media for you at the moment. We're in a period of transition where traditional media sites such as newspapers, magazines, TV, and radio are no longer able to operate on the same business model because of the advent of the internet. So a whole host of online sites are now accessible and are producing content and being consumed by the general public. Those sites tend to sell advertising at a lesser rate and at a decreased rate from old traditional models, like I mentioned, newspapers, magazines, etc. Those traditional outlets typically made their money from advertising or sale of classified ads, or to a lesser degree from subscription rates. And that's no longer the same landscape as it was in the past. So what we're finding is that while the internet has increased the number of voices and the diversity of voices producing news content, which is a good thing, it's also made it more difficult for journalists to find full-time positions or staff writer positions. So there are an increased number of freelancing writers who will work for multiple publications and sell their stories in that way. Many oftentimes having to do other things on the side to make a living and working without the benefits of healthcare and other things that come with full-time employment. It's a good thing to keep in mind if you consider being a journalist. Some of the best advice I've heard lately is learn to live on air and don't spend money on clothing and live in cheap rent. I think over the next decades, we'll continue to see this transition taking place, and media outlets are harder pressed now to find how they will make a living and pay their writers. What does a journalist do? Well, for the most part, that hasn't changed as far as story writing goes. In many ways, the model of putting together a story is still very much the same. A writer will go to an editor, whether it's at a publication they're employed for or one that they are familiar with and that think would be a good outlet for a story, and they will pitch that story to the editor there. Oh, there we go. And that pitch should convey the writer's unique ability to tell a story. The story should be timely and pertinent to this moment in news, and it should be compelling. And the writer has to convince the editor that they are the best person to write it. If the editor says, yes, go ahead, please write this story, and we'll pay you this much money, here's your deadline, the writer then goes on to research and report that story. So let's use an example. Let's say I'm writing a story about feeding tubes and the use of feeding tubes in prisons. If you think at the moment right now, Guantanamo is in the news because there are a number of prisoners who are on hunger strike, and they are being force-fed with feeding tubes in order to be kept alive. This is a story that perhaps would appeal to a national newspaper, let's say. So if I have an editor that says, yes, I want you to write this story for us, I would then go to, if I can, prisoners who are on hunger strike to talk to them about why, and to talk to them about what it's like to be fed with a feeding tube. I would talk to medical bioethicists about the ethics of using feeding tubes on prisoners who have no say about whether they want to eat or not when a feeding tube is used. I would perhaps talk to lawyers who are also working on cases surrounding feeding tube usage. So I would talk to all these individuals, and then I would gather statistics about the rate of feeding tube usage or the history of feeding tube use. And then I go into the process of writing the story. And depending on how much information I've got and where I would like the story to go, some of these steps will merge. So I may end up doing research as I'm writing, or writing and then doing more research. So it can go back and forth. After I turn in the piece to an editor, I would be asked to shape the piece in conjunction with that editor's comments for most appropriate format for that publication. When we get it to the place where we'd like it, that article is then sent to a line editor who would go through every sentence or line and look at the spelling, the grammar, the use of punctuation, and would do that series of edits on it. Then the piece would go to a fact checker, particularly at larger organizations where fact checking is incredibly important. The last thing you want to do is have incorrect information in a media publication, and the fact checker makes sure that everything you're saying is true and that it can be verified. Then, hopefully, if everything's gone well, the piece will go to publish. So if it's in a print publication, let's say a newspaper, that would be a daily publish date. Magazines have a different publishing schedule, and online is almost immediate. Again, because the landscape has changed so much, writers have much more involvement these days in then the promotion of an article. And writers often use social media like Twitter or Facebook to share the article around as much as they can. If it's very important and catches a lot of attention, that article could be picked up by larger publications and so may have a continuing life outside of the publication it was initially intended for. For instance, when I did do an article on feeding tubes for Guernica magazine in January, I also did some follow-up interviews with radio stations who were interested in the subject matter. And that's putting together a story in a nutshell. And that's the landscape of journalism at the moment. If you have any questions, this is me, Ann Neumann, and that's my email address. You can contact me. Thanks for asking. Bye.